This recording is for Module 5 in Marine Biology, and this is the second module on the invertebrates. So in this module, just so you have a sense of where we're going, in this module we're going to talk about 4 different phylum, and we'll talk about different classes within these phylum, but the 4 phylum that we will be talking about are phylum Mollusca, phylum Arthropoda, phylum Echinodermata, and lastly we will talk a little bit about phylum Chordata, although there aren't a lot of organisms that are invertebrates in phylum Chordata, but we will mention those that are. So we're just going to work our way through these 4 phylum that are the rest of the invertebrates that we are going to study in marine biology. Okay, so let's start with phylum Mollusca. Sometimes we just refer to these as the mollusk. And so organisms that you would think about when you think about this phylum are clams, squid, and octopus. Okay, so before we look at individual classes, I want to go through some general characteristics of organisms within phylum Mollusca. One is that they have bilateral symmetry, and that means that you can draw a line down the middle of these organisms that would divide them into right and left halves, so they would have equal right and left halves. That's what bilateral symmetry is. They have a soft body, but they also have some type of shell, and we'll deal more specifically with that as we get into different organisms. They have a mantle, and what a mantle is it's a covering around the organs. So the mantle goes around the organs, and the mantle is also important because it is the mantle that makes the shell. So the mantle secretes calcium carbonate, and then it's that calcium carbonate that then forms the shell. The mantle also is involved in respiration. So we'll see that as we look at specific organisms. So those are 4 characteristics of phylum Mollusca. A few more that we'll do. So we're still talking about phylum Mollusca. They have a foot, and as you might guess, that foot is used for locomotion, so it's used for movement. However, it is also used to get food, and we'll see how that is done as we look at specific organisms. They breathe through gills. They don't have lungs, they breathe through gills. And then lastly, they have a radula. And you might remember this from biology, but these are rows of small teeth and those rows of small teeth are used for obtaining food. Okay, so those are some general characteristics of phylum Mollusca. Let's look now at some phyla within it, or some classes. So we'll start with class Gastropoda. So this literally means stomach foot. And the organism that makes up this class are the snails. And if you think about the snails, what a snail really is, it's a mass of organs that's surrounded with a shell. We'll look at a picture here in a moment. They have a head, and we'll see when we look at the picture that the head has tentacles. And those tentacles have receptors on them that are used to sense the environment. Some of them also have eyes. They don't all have eyes, but some of the tentacles do have eyes on them. We will see that they have a radula on their head. And here the radula, it can be used to scrape food off rocks. It can also, the radula also can paralyze like worms or fish that the snail is going to eat, so that it's a means of it's used as a means of getting food. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at a picture of a snail. Okay, so here's a snail, and remember I said that they're basically a mass of organs. So here's the mass of organs, and then we have this shell around them. The things I'll point out are, here's the radula. So down here in this area, right down in the bottom left corner, you see the radula, those row of teeth that can be used, and you can see it's right near those, that radula is right by the mouth, so that the food can be scraped into the mouth, or if something is paralyzed, if the radula is used to paralyze something, then it can be scraped into the mouth. Here's the tentacles. Here kind of in the middle, you see the tentacles. And again, those have receptors on them. Some of them would also have eyes on them. And if you just look here in the middle, it's just a mass of organs. You see a heart, an anus, a gill. So they don't have lungs, they breathe through gills. You know, the gut or the stomach is related to that. I guess one thing I did not mention previously was this operculum. The operculum is, an operculum is something that is a structure that covers an opening. Maybe we'll go back to the whiteboard and I'll write that on there. So we'll see this in some other organisms. I think we studied it in biology. So when we studied the perch, there was the operculum covers the gills in a perch, but generally an operculum covers an opening. So the snail does have an operculum that covers one of its opening. Okay, so that's all I'm going to say about our class Gastropoda. The next one we'll do is class Bivalva. And just by the name, you should figure out that it's a two-piece shell with a hinge. So two-piece shell with a hinge. So in this, you would think of things like mussels, clams, oysters, scallops. Okay, so that two-piece shell with a hinge. They have, in terms of their eating habits, these organisms have gills, and the gills have cilia on them. And what those, by beating, remember those cilia are, you know, these tiny hair-like structures that beat. Well, the cilia will pull in water, and as they pull in water, there's food in that water. So the gills, even though they're a breathing mechanism, they are also really important for getting food in. And then in addition to the gills, these organisms also have a siphon. And what the siphons do is it's kind of like a straw. They intake and expel water. Okay, so food gets trapped by the gills, and then it goes to the mouth, and then the siphon also is involved in taking in water. Most of you probably know how a pearl is formed in the oysters, which are members of class Bivalva. So a piece of sand gets into the body, and then the oyster secretes a material around that because it's an irritant. So they produce this material around it as a means of protection against that irritation. And that the pearl is actually produced by the mantle, and it's calcium carbonate. So it's the same substance that the shell is made out of, but because it's laid down in layers, and it can be very intricately shaped around that piece of sand. They are very valuable. So let's go and see if we can find a picture of, so here's mussels, clams, and scallops. All of those are examples of bivalves. And then if we look at the bivalve, just the thing, so here's the gills. Over here on the far right side, down near the bottom, you can see the gills. And the other thing that I mentioned were these siphons here on the right-hand side that take in water and expel water. The gills, I don't think on here, they don't really show, on the gills, you can't really see the cilia, but the cilia are really involved in pulling water into the bivalve, and then the food can be extracted from that water. Okay, so let's go back. Okay, so then the next class, okay, so we're still talking about the mollusks, but the next class are the cephalopods. And this literally means head foot. So we had stomach foot, and now we have head foot. And these would be things like squid, octopuses, and cuttlefish. I'm not going to say a lot about cuttlefish. If you've ever had a bird, like a pet parakeet or something, the skeleton of the cuttlefish is often used to as a beak sharpener for things like parakeets. So I won't say anything more about cuttlefish. This class of the mollusk are carnivores. So they're meat eaters. And they have suckers on their tentacles. So I'm sure you're aware of that with regard to the octopus, where you have probably seen the suckers on their tentacles. Their brains are larger and more complex than most of the other mollusks. And kind of related to that, their eyes, they have an eye structure that is very similar to what we have, where they have a retina, cornea, they have an iris and a lens. So their eye structure is very similar to that of humans. If we look at the cephalopods in terms of their movement, they have a muscular mantle around the gills, and they have no shell around it. So it's the mantle, which is muscle, around the gills. And we'll see this in a picture in just a moment. So so it's important that we understand that this mantle is a muscle, because when they contract that muscle, they shoot out water. So contract this muscle, and that allows them to shoot out water, and then that if they shoot out water in one direction, that moves them in the opposite direction. So this mantle, which is made of muscle, is really important for the cephalopods movement. They also have a siphon, and the thing about their siphon is that they can direct it they can point it in different directions, and so they are able to control their movement because they can direct that siphon and the directions in which they're shooting out water. So they can control their motion because they're able to point that siphon in different directions. Also, through that siphon, they are also able to release a dark fluid that we call it ink, but that dark fluid can confuse enemies. So it's a defense mechanism. It can also, the ink that is released can also dull the senses of the predators, so that they don't sense the presence of the cephalopod. So the mantle contracting to shoot out that water, the siphon enables them to direct their movement, and then by releasing this dark fluid, they can confuse or make predators less likely to be able to sense them. What's the difference between octopus? Well, we all know that an octopus has 8 arms or 8 tentacles. They live on the floor of the ocean, and they look for food. So often you'll usually find octopus on the ocean floor. And it's on the ocean floor that they look for food. And they actually, they have a beak that they bite their prey. And remember, they're carnivores, so they will, they'll eat crabs, lobsters. They also can inject a poison. So when they bite the prey, they can also inject a poison into them. And so that's their means of getting food. If you look at the squid, a squid is different from an octopus because it has 10 arms, and 2 of those arms are longer, and those arms are used to capture their prey. We have mentioned chitin before, which is that it's a carbohydrate shell-like material. Well, the squids have chitin as their internal shell. So remember I said that they do have shells, but they're not always external shells. So in this case, it's an internal shell on a squid. If we look at the digestive system, of the cephalopods in general, they have a digestive system that goes from the mouth to the anus. So remember, some of the organisms that we looked at last week, they didn't have a true digestive system. These do have a true digestive system. If we look at the circulatory system, they have a heart that pumps blood. So the heart does act like a pump. However, you might remember from biology that one type of circulatory system is called an open circulatory system. And that means that the blood doesn't circulate in blood vessels, but it just gets dumped into open cavities and it comes in direct contact with the tissue. So the blood is pumped by the heart, but it's not pumped into blood vessels, it's pumped into cavities, and then the tissues are directly bathed with that blood. So this type of circulatory system depends a lot on gravity, because the blood isn't being pumped through blood vessels. So it depends a lot on gravity in order for it to move. Now, the cephalopods actually have a closed circulatory system. So in the cephalopods, all of the other mollusks that we've looked at have an open circulatory system, but the cephalopods have a closed circulatory system, and blood actually gets circulated in blood vessels. If we look at reproduction for the cephalopods, most of them are male or female, so they have most of them are not hermaphrodites. They are one or the other. There are some hermaphrodites, but most are male or female. So some hermaphrodites, but not the majority. And they reproduce by external fertilization. So what that means is that the egg and sperm get released into the water, and then so the males release sperm, the females release eggs, and then you hope that fertilization occurs. So most of the mollusk reproduce by external fertilization. However, the cephalopods reproduce by they reproduce by internal fertilization. So in that case, in the case of the cephalopods, the male uses one of his arms to transfer sperm to the female. And the female lays the eggs, and the female watches over them. The males die soon after they have mated, so soon after they've transferred their sperm to the female, they die. And often the females don't eat while they're watching the eggs, and they will die soon after those eggs hatch. So the gestational period for octopus eggs is about 5 to 10 months. For the cephalopods, the female will watch over those eggs for 5 to 10 months, and then she dies soon after those eggs hatch. Okay, so that finishes up the mollusk, the phylum Mollusca. Now we're going to go on to phylum Arthropoda. And we're going to talk about some different classes within this. Actually, I think we're only going to talk about the crustaceans as a class, but so phylum Arthropoda would include things like shrimp, lobster, and crab. All those fun things that we like to eat are phylum Arthropoda. They have an exoskeleton, and that exoskeleton is made of chitin. And in this case, the exoskeleton is on top of the muscles. So that's different from us, where our muscles are on top of our skeleton. When you have an exoskeleton, the exoskeleton is on top of the muscle. And so the only way that growth can take place is that they have to shed the exoskeleton and grow a new one. So what they do is they take in water to expand themselves, and while they have that water in them, then the new exoskeleton will grow. And then once the new exoskeleton has been formed, then the water leaves. So now they have an exoskeleton that is bigger than them, and they have room to grow into it. So that's an amazing feature that organisms that have an exoskeleton have, is that ability to grow an exoskeleton by taking on water and growing a skeleton that's bigger than them, and then they have room to grow into it. The only class that we're going to talk about is class Crustacea. And class Crustacea, they have gills, so they extract oxygen from the water as the water flows over the gills. They have 2 pairs of antennae for sensing. Antennae. For sensing. There are very tiny crustaceans that you would find on reefs or even like floating like plankton, but they're crustacea. So they can be very tiny, but then they can also be quite large. So maybe you've heard of barnacles. Let's go ahead and erase this. And one example of crustaceans are barnacles. The unique thing about barnacles is that they have 2 larval stages. And in their second larval stage, they will attach to something hard. And then as they are attached to that something hard, then they rely on waves or currents to bring them food, because they can move their appendages to get plankton from the water, but they're attached to something so that they themselves cannot move. Many crustaceans, especially the larger ones, have a head and a thorax. So this is especially true of the larger crustaceans. They have a head and thorax, so that's called a cephalothorax. So the head and abdomen are often just combined into one, and then they will have a structure called a carapace that is used to cover the anterior portion of them. It's like a protective mechanism over the anterior part of the organism. So it basically covers the head and the thorax. So they have a cephalothorax, and then behind that they have the abdomen. So in insects, they have a head, a thorax, and an abdomen. So they have 3 parts. But in the crustaceans, the head and the thorax are combined into one, and then they have the abdomen behind that. So they have 2 main body parts. What are some of the organisms that make up the crustaceans? Well, we already mentioned shrimp and lobster. Crabs. They are called decapods because they have 10 legs. They have teeth inside their stomach to grind things. we saw this, I think, in a crayfish that you dissect in biology. You can see those teeth inside of the stomach. They have an open circulatory system, so they're very dependent on gravity for making sure that blood gets circulated. So remember, so an open circulatory system is where the blood gets, it doesn't circulate in blood vessels, it gets dumped into cavities. In terms of reproduction, they are male or female, so they're not both. And the males will transfer the sperm to the female. So male transfers sperm to female. And then the female may actually just store those sperm and then fertilize the eggs at a later time. So the fertilization doesn't necessarily take place at the same point in time when the male transfers the sperm to them. Okay, so that is phylum Arthropoda. So we talked really just about class crustacean within phylum Arthropoda. Okay, so we got two more. The next one is phylum Echinodermata. Echinodermata. And here we are talking about sea stars, sea urchins, and sand dollars. Those are the things that you are probably most familiar with that come from this phylum. So they're a little bit different from the other organisms that we've looked at so far because they have an endoskeleton. So their skeleton is on the inside, not on the outside. And so usually when you find if you've ever found a sea urchin or a sand dollar or a sea star, they're usually hard, right? Well, that is because by the time you find them, the muscle tissue that is on the outside has already deteriorated, has already decomposed. And so what you are finding really is just the inside skeleton. They have what is referred to as a water vascular system. And that means that they have these canals that are filled with water, and those canals that are filled with water are what is used for movement and feeding. So they have this tube that they will fill with water, and that's used for movement. And then muscles on one side of them can pump water to the other side, so that there's a lot of force on that one side, and they can actually just by directing the water from one side to the other, they can create enough pressure that they can pry open the shells of clams. So if we were to look at some of the different classes, one class within the Echinodermata is class Asteroida. An asteroid, you should be able to, Asteroidea. So this is like the starfish. So these are the sea stars. So we get our word asteroid from that. So they can actually, these guys can actually push their stomachs out of their body to digest something. Fascinating. So they pry open a they pry open a really small opening in a clam, and then they can put their stomach inside the clam and they can eat the clam. So fascinating way for them to eat. I think your book mentions that they can, the opening that they require, they just require to get that clam open about 1/10 of a millimeter. So that's just a teeny tiny opening, but then they're able to put their stomach inside of that. Most of these have 5 arms. They can have more, but most have 5. Some can have as much as 10, but most of them just have 5. So class Asteroida. Another class in this category is class Ophiuroida. Ophiuroida. And these would be things like brittle stars. Maybe if you've been to the beach, maybe you have found a brittle star. These are sensitive to light, so they mostly come out at night. We'll look at some pictures here in a moment. And then the last class that we'll talk about are the class Echinoidea. And these are like sea urchins and sand dollars. So the sea urchins have an endoskeleton with spines on it. So they have an endoskeleton. And then that endoskeleton has spines on it. The sand dollars, they also have an endoskeleton. So all of these have endoskeletons. So even though we think of them as being, you know, hard organisms, their skeleton is on the inside. And when we find them, what we're really finding is just the endoskeleton, and all the soft tissue has decomposed. These organisms don't usually swim. They live on the bottom, and they are able to. They're also able to turn their stomach out so that they can get food that way. The interesting thing about the echinoderms is that they don't have a circulatory system. So if they don't have a circulatory system, how do they get nutrients throughout the body? Well, their body cavities fill with fluid, and then that fluid is what transports the nutrients. So unlike organs with where blood transport the nutrients. Here, the body cavity itself fills with fluids. How do the echinoderms reproduce? Well, they can reproduce in several ways. One is that there are separate males and females, so they can reproduce sexually, and the eggs and sperm are released at about the same time every year. So eggs and sperm released into the water, and then because they're released at about the same time, then fertilization can take place. However, they can also regenerate as a means of reproducing. So if they can regenerate, so that if one of the arms comes off of a sea star, that arm can grow into a new sea star, and then the one that lost the arm can also just regenerate its arm. So I think your book talks about how when early clam fishermen, the starfish were eating their clams, and so they were just cutting the things in half, thinking they were killing them, when in fact they were just helping them to reproduce, because they would just regenerate. So we know that one means of reproduction for the echinoderms is through regeneration. Okay, last thing I'm going to talk about then, very briefly, is phylum Chordata. And the reason we're not going to talk about these much is because there are only two, there's two invertebrate subphylum. And one vertebrate phylum, but that one vertebrate phylum includes all of the marine vertebrates that we'll be talking about over the next couple weeks. Okay, so the thing that the phylum Chordata is that they all have a notochord. So the notochord is it's a nerve cord that runs the length of the body. So if this notochord turns into a vertebrae, then it would be part of the vertebrates. If it doesn't turn into vertebrae, then it becomes part of the invertebrate system. So they have this long nerve cord, and then what all the organisms that make up phylum Chordata end up with is they end up with a dorsal nerve cord. So dorsal, remember, is like the back. So for us in humans, that dorsal nerve cord is our spinal cord. But other, even those who are in the subphylum invertebrates, they still have this dorsal nerve cord that runs up the back side. So some of the organisms that are part of the subphylum invertebrates of the chordatas would be things like a lancet. I'll show you a picture of a lancet in just a moment. There's something called a tunicate. They're called tunicates because they cover themselves with like a leather-like tunic. Sea squirts is another one that would be members of that subphylum. So we're not going to spend a lot of time on those because we'll spend significantly more time when we talk about the vertebrates that are a member of phylum Chordata. Okay, let's go through some of these figures. Okay, so that's the bivalve. We already looked at that. Okay, so here you can see the body segments. So here's on this lobster, you can see the cephalothorax, so the head and the thorax combine into one segment, and then you have the abdomen on the back end. Here's a crab where you can see this whole thing here would be the cephalothorax, and then the abdomen underneath there. Let's say anything about that. Here's some examples of the Echinodermata, so the sea star, brittle star, sea urchins. Here's the sea star. Remember I said they have symmetry, so these they typically have five arms. You can divide them into 5 pieces. So remember I mentioned this water vascular system that the sea stars have. So they are able to pump water into their system and move in that way. Nothing about that one. Oh, here's a sea star that's regenerating. So they've lost one of the arms, and they will then regenerate from that lost arm. So these are from the subphylum Chordata. So we have sea squirts here, and here's a lancet. And the last picture I think I have is here's a lancet. And you can see its size relative to a quarter. Okay, so that's going to finish up the material for Module 5.